Um, Thank you for coming this morning, and thank you for the rain so that I feel like I'm at home. In London, this sort of rain's just normal. Clearly here, it's like a disaster. It's like a really big deal. So I really appreciate you fighting your way through the rain to get here. And thank you for the invitation to come and speak at your research week. Obviously, I've been looking at what the university does, and it looks really interesting, especially the fact that you're all online as well, which I think, is pretty spectacular that you've been doing that for 20 years, if you can remember what it was like 20 years ago online and how quickly everything's changed. So this morning, generally when I'm speaking, even though it's a little bit difficult to see you through the lights, I'm very happy for people to stop me and ask questions at any point, okay? I'll speak for, I don't know exactly how long, but it's quite a long period of time that I've got to speak, and we'll make the most of that. So there's a couple of things we're going to do. One of them is we're going to do a miniature version of the visitor and residence mapping exercise. So that should wake you up. And also, there's a little quiz in the middle as well, okay? So what I'm trying to do, because what happens is you get invited to speak about the digital and innovative pedagogies, and you find that you're just talking at people for an hour, and it feels a bit ironic, okay? So I thought it would be a good idea if we actually did something interactive at a couple of points. So there's the way that I've sort of organized this is that I'm going to be talking about the visitor and residence idea sort of from a research perspective. So the way that that's developed as something that can underpin research and the different directions that's gone in. But I'm also going to be talking about, obviously, some of the things that it's informed, some of the findings, some of the sort of larger themes that have come out of the work over time. But rather than do that thing of doing a talk where I do background and then method, and then everybody's asleep by the time I get to findings, I've actually put the kind of findings throughout the talk, okay? So you'll spot them because they're on a black background, all right? So what I'll do is I'll ask you to pay particular attention when they come up. Is that right? Yeah, good, excellent. So just a little bit about me. I'm Head of Technology Enhanced Learning at the University of the Arts London. Now, interestingly, okay, the Chancellor, who's the kind of symbolic head of the university in the UK, of my last institution looked like that, Chris Patton, and the Chancellor of my current university looks like that, okay? So you could say that I've gone from one extreme to the other, but the more I look at that picture, the more I'm not sure who's wearing the more unusual outfit. Do you know what I mean? If you stare at it for a while, you're like, actually, I'm not sure anymore. So, that's been interesting for me because I've gone from a very, very traditional university in the UK, very academic in a very kind of classic way, to a university which is focused on the creative arts and has a completely different kind of approaches to pedagogy and what it's about. Just to give you an idea, one of our colleges is Central St Martin's. We're made up of 6 different colleges. We're the largest creative arts-focused higher education institution in Europe. Maybe the world, nobody's sure. We're made up of 6 colleges. Central St Martin's there, you see, got 5 Oscar nominations. So there's, the alumni that comes out of the various colleges is pretty spectacular. So my Vice-Chancellor, not the Chancellor, not the man in the dress, but the Vice-Chancellor who's runs the university directly, a little while ago he gave this speech, and this is really kind of where I'm coming from. So he says, we're now living in a post-digital world, and our task is now to deal with the social, cultural, economic, and political impacts of digital technology as much as with the technology itself, okay? Now, I'll come back to what we mean by post-digital, but this is the actual idea in an educational context came from myself and a group of colleagues back in 2009. And we're not saying that the digital's over, we're sort of saying that it's everywhere. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But I think what's useful to do is to sort of step back and just to think about the nature of the digital and how strange it is in many ways. So, you know, if you're running a virtual learning environment, then even in a face-to-face university, that's probably the biggest learning environment in your institution. You know, it's much bigger than a room like this. And yet it's not really, it's sort of unseen. It's on everybody's screen separately. And that's what really interests me, and I think that's one of the challenges, is that you can't really get to grips with what the digital looks like, because it looks different for everybody. And there's a guy called Kevin Kelly who did a really interesting, very, very simple project where he just asked people to draw a picture of the internet and mark where their home is on it. And that's it. And he gets all sorts of different results. There's a Flickr group of these. So here's a good example. That's from a 12-year-old. And what they've done here, I think, is they've sort of drawn like the infrastructure, all the wires and all the servers. It sort of looks like they're all separate computers, and you've got Google somewhere in the middle, and their home on Wi-Fi is a laptop. So that's one view of the digital, okay? Another view, this is more like my view of the internet. It's just all kind of, you know, all over the place. And there's the little squares, perhaps their websites, and the little red square down there is perhaps their home. So that, you know, already you're seeing quite a significant difference in the way that you're perceiving the digital. There's a good one as well, that idea of just a huge amount of stuff that sort of squeezes through your computer and then goes back out the other side. And then this one here, just a cloud of smiley faces. So it very much depends how you see it. Different people perceive the digital in various different ways. Let's not forget, all of these people are answering the same question. Please draw a map of the internet and indicate your home. And it goes from a whole great big load of servers connected to wires through to just a cloud of smiley faces with, I think it's me in the middle. So their home is them, not the technology. And that's really, that's kind of the background of where I'm coming from. And that's the challenge for us, is that the digital is many different things to many different people. And it's very, very difficult to model it from that point of view. So from Google's point of view, this was a big advert that was on the Underground. And it says knowledge is not always within reach, but on the advert, they've scrawled out the not. So that Google's claiming that knowledge is always within reach. And I think that this is quite often how universities think of the internet, of the web, that it's a great big pool of knowledge, like a great big sort of untidy library that you can consume and engage with. Depends what you mean by knowledge. But for me, if we think about those maps of the internet that go from servers to people, I adjusted this slightly to say it's also that people are always within reach. I think that's fundamentally what's behind the visitor and residence thinking, which I'll come on to in a moment. Now, this idea of digital natives, how many people know about Mark Prensky's idea of digital immigrants and digital natives? Some of you, okay. So around about 2000, around about the turn of the century, Mark Prensky came up with this idea that some people are digital natives, they're native to the digital environment, and some people are immigrants, they're sort of coming into it. And really what he was saying was that if you grew up, if you're young enough to have grown up with all this digital technology around you, then it will just be a natural part of your environment. And you will have learnt how to use it in the same way, perhaps, that you speak your first language. Okay, so you'll have just taken it on board and made it part of your life. Whereas if you're a little bit older and the digital technology appeared when you were an adult, then you'd have to learn it more explicitly. And the way that you used it would perhaps be a little bit more like you trying to speak a second language. So it would never be quite as fluent. Now, what this came to be, people used this idea in various ways. But it basically ended up being, old people don't understand the internet. You know, that's what happened to it. And I think quite a lot of universities used it as a reason to not engage with the students that were coming in. Because they'd see the students coming in and they'd say, well, they understand all that digital stuff. We don't understand it, so we'll just let them get on with it. And it definitely didn't really work that way. I mean, I'm not totally against the fact that the idea exists. Somebody had to start somewhere when we were thinking about the internet. But this is my sort of first sort of overall general point, which is that post-digital idea is not the same as digital natives, okay? So when I'm talking about post-digital, I'm talking about the idea that technology has become so much part of our lives and part of our learning that it has sort of disappeared into use. So we no longer really think about it being technology. We're just using it, we're just getting on with it. So that's what we mean by post-digital, is we could stop thinking about technology as technology, and we could start thinking about, well, what are we trying to actually achieve with the technology? What are we trying to do with it? What's its impact? What's its implications? What's its influence? Okay. But I think in some ways we've confused that, or we've joined that with the idea of digital natives. And fundamentally, we've confused the idea of ownership with competency, or ownership with capability, or ownership with literacy. So in my institution, we see all the students coming through the door with lovely MacBook Airs and iPhone 6s, and perhaps historically, you know, we've thought, oh, they must be really good at using those because they own them. Their phone's much nicer than mine, so they must know all about technology. But it's really, really simple. You know, owning an iPhone 6 doesn't mean that you're good at researching for your essay. Seems obvious, doesn't it? Owning an iPhone 6 doesn't mean that you're really, really good at collaborating online. Owning an iPhone 6 or whatever new shiny technology doesn't mean that you understand how to engage in higher education. And that's where the idea kind of stops. Okay, that's where the problem comes from. You can't make distinctions, really strong distinctions that are generational like that. And everybody likes a generation gap, really. So we like to distinguish ourselves from you know, generation to generation, which is one of the reasons why I think the digital native idea was so popular. So I proposed this visitor in residence idea, which was to sort of move things on, because what I found when I was talking to students and staff was that there was this split. So this was a while ago that I first was researching digital and learning and came up with this sort of principle. And what I found was, at the time, there was quite a hard split between those people who were happy to have a digital identity or a presence online and those people who weren't. But I realized that the split wasn't based on age, and it also wasn't based on technical skill. So it wasn't like the people who didn't have a Facebook profile were too stupid to use Facebook. Of course it wasn't. It was that they'd chosen not to because they didn't feel that was relevant. So this idea is based on motivation to engage, rather than age or technical skill. And it's not two people, it's different modes of engagement. So I'm not either a visitor or resident, but depending on what I'm doing online, I might be operating in more of a visitor mode or more of a resident mode. So it's a sliding scale. So the easiest way to describe it is to sort of talk about either end of that scale, of that continuum. So in a visitor mode, let's say you go online and you're in visitor mode, you've decided what you want to achieve, and you go online and you do that job, and then you come away again. So the way I liken it to figuring out what you want to do, opening up like the untidy toolbox of the web, and rummaging around for the tool that you think is going to work, using it, putting it back, and closing the lid. So that might be things like searching in Google, reading information, doing your banking, doing shopping, things like that. Now, importantly, you're not leaving behind a social trace. Okay? You might be leaving behind a data trace, but you're not leaving behind a social trace. So that's the visitor end of the continuum. The resident end of the continuum is really where you're going online because you want to connect with other people. Okay, in one form or another, and there are lots of different ways that you could do that. And you're thinking about the web, well, you're not directly thinking about it this way, but it's useful to think it, you know, in resident mode. The web becomes a series of spaces or places. So the way that I define space or place is somewhere where other people are, okay? So examples of that is you might go online, you might go into Facebook or into Twitter to engage with people socially. You might go into a forum in Moodle to discuss a subject, okay? But you're expressing your opinion and it's attached to your identity. So in resident mode, you do have a digital identity and you are kind of projecting that identity into the web. Now, at the sort of extreme end of residency, I see this end of residency as being very visible online. So anything that you do that might be that you could Google to, or anything that you could do that's completely open. So from that point of view, tweeting, Twitter's my main thing, and anybody, including my mum, it turns out, can follow me on Twitter. And so that's very, very open activity. So I see that as being right at that end of the continuum. But importantly, somewhere more towards the middle is where we are in a resident mode, but we're operating within a kind of known group or known community that's got an edge. So from a higher education point of view, let's imagine that was a cohort on a course and that you're having a discussion, but you have to log in and only people on that course can get into that discussion. So if you think about it, everybody in that discussion is still expressing their opinions, they're still leaving a social trace. So when they come away, they've left a kind of trace of themselves, but it's just within that kind of box of that community. Now, it's really important to say that one mode is not better than another mode, okay? They're just two different modes that have this sliding scale. So I'm not trying to claim that being resident is better than being visitor or vice versa. It depends what you're trying to do. The other thing that I'm not trying to claim is that everybody should necessarily become resident, if you like. It depends. It depends on what you think you need. So what I did for my institution, for the University of Arts London, was I simplified it into 3 boxes. So you can take that principle and you can put it into an educational context. And I looked at it from a student's perspective. And it became these 3 boxes. So when a student, quite often what we've found, because we've done research looking at incoming students' expectations of higher education and digital. And when students arrive, quite often what they want is just tools and stuff and resources. They say, just give me the stuff that I need to do my course. I don't need to talk to you. I just want access to the stuff and I'll get on with it. And quite often that is perpetuated by school, by the way that they learn in school. Now we know that if that's all we do, then people get miserable and they drop out and they disengage. But nevertheless, quite often that's what they ask for, but actually what they need is more of a connection. So that's kind of at the visitor end. In the middle, this idea of shop window. So it's where you want to put your work online, you want to get noticed by the world. That's especially important if you're in the creative disciplines. So you put your stuff out there online in an open way for people to look at, but you're not necessarily expecting to be part of a conversation or discourse. So you might make a Tumblr site and it might have an email address and say, contact me if you're interested in my work. But that's probably the extent of it. And that happens a lot. And then at this end, spaces, you're thinking about the web more as a space where there are people, where you can build a network, okay? So that's in resident mode. So what I did was I mapped the kind of capabilities or literacies that I felt you have to develop as you were moving through, okay? And as I say, visitor modes are not necessarily worse or better than resident modes, but one way of interpreting the process of higher education and the digital is to say, actually a lot of our students arrive here and we'd like them to, when they leave us, when they graduate, we'd like them to be there, okay? So you'll notice in terms of the capabilities and the literacies, you get things like voice, like developing your voice as a person, being able to kind of put your ideas out into the world, really, really important. And then that idea of belonging, okay? So you can't belong in visitor mode because there's no other people to belong to. But in the resident mode, you can become part of a network and you can start belonging to that network. And we know that that's incredibly important, both for learning, but also as you go out and in terms of employability and your professional life as well. So for me, that's a kind of important journey that we can help students to make. it's not as simple as just suddenly flipping from one to the other. I think that sometimes what we can do pedagogically is we really believe in this idea of belonging and voice and all of the rest of it. That's certainly my sort of educational philosophy. So I believe that education is a process of becoming, if you like, of changing as a person, rather than just filling your head with stuff. But even if you believe in that, you can't just say, hey, we're not going to write some essays that I'm going to mark and give back to you in private. What we're going to do is we're all going to blog, and everybody's going to look at each other's blogs and comment on them. Now, if you're a first-year undergraduate, that's really quite scary. There's too much of a jump, okay? So I think it's our job as educators to scaffold people through from the left to the right. That's one way that you could look at the sort of process of what we're doing. It's one way of sort of conceiving of that. Okay, this is an indulgence. I got this, do you get this thing where every so often you come across an idea and you sort of fall in love with it, even though you don't quite understand it? Perhaps that's just me. There's this philosopher, Gadamer, who wrote a book in 1960 called Truth and Method. And I'm not going to go into it in detail, but in one way he was saying you could sort of have truth or you can have method, but it's very difficult to have both, and in some ways it doesn't really work like that anyway, all right? Now, the reason that I bring it up is because I want to sort of go through how visitors and residents, because I've explained visitors and residents as a nice simple idea. And that works. I know that works because people use it. But as soon as you start trying to turn it into a research implement or method, you get caught up in lots of complexities. And to me, they relate to this idea, which is at one end, you can just talk to people and say, what do you think about this individually? You know, what's inside your head? What do you mean by this? And then at the other end of the spectrum, you can do larger scale things, and you can say, this group of people act in this way, and you can present it as a series of bar charts, and you can quantify it. Now, to me, they're both problematic, and I think it's a really difficult thing to do from a research point of view. And obviously, the real challenge with working in education is that it's very social science. It's about how people feel. It's about people's motivations. It's about their behaviors. And that's quite difficult stuff to capture. So just to give you a quick background, this is the original visitor and residence project that we did with OCLC and University of North Carolina, Charlotte. And this was, we interviewed lots of different people in the US and the UK from late stage secondary school all the way up through all of the years of university and staff at university, okay? And we used the visitor and residence idea to sort of frame that project. And here's some of the data that came out of it. So we created a code book and we coded up the interviews along certain thematic lines. So this is a tree diagram of what we found in the motivation section, if you like, of what we were doing. So we were asking people, well, why did you choose to do something online instead of doing it another way? Now, that was interesting, because you'd ask students, quite a lot of students, how do you go about doing research? How do you go about finding out what you need to know? And there'd be this nasty pause, and they'd go, you're talking about Googling? Because they didn't know that there was any other way of doing it. So they found, it had already disappeared into use, which I think is another challenge in research terms, is that practices become normalized so quickly, sometimes it's quite difficult to talk about them, okay? Now, what interested me about this, so this works along the lines of the greener the square and the bigger the square, the more prevalent, the more often that came up, and less so through to the red. And what you can see is convenience is top, which is not surprising. So a lot of people you'd say, why did you go online instead of going to the library? And they'd say, well, it's faster and easier, okay? So that came up a lot. And searching, fair enough. But very quickly, you get connection and sharing with others and collaboration, okay? Which I thought was really interesting. Because what you can see there is, if you like, visitor-style activity and resident-style activity jammed together right at the top of that chart. So some of that's about stuff, some of it's about content, about getting access to resources, and some of it is about connecting with other people. And this came out at the other end of what we were doing as well, because we asked people, well, where do you go to when you want to find something out? You know, where do you go to? What's the first thing you do when you want to find something out? And because we had visitor and residents underpinning the project, we didn't just list off the library and a load of websites. We included people, okay? And you can see the top one's Wikipedia. There's a lot about Wikipedia, which I might talk about a little bit, but then, which is just a place full of material. And then teachers, friends, peers, mother, father. It became people very, very quickly. You know, and I think that this, perhaps sometimes we forget this, is that very often when people want to find something out, they go and ask somebody else. And then that person might point them in the direction of a piece of content, or they might just tell them because they've got that knowledge. But from my perspective with the digital, and we think about visitor and residents again, often students will go online to find a person to ask them about something, okay? So it's a real mix. So this point here, which, as I say, it's on a black background, so it may or may not be worth paying attention, is I put them in every so often just to, you know. What we found was what I described as, very emotively, as a learning black market. This is really, really important from an education point of view, is that students had all these practices and all these places that they went to find out information and to get their learning work done. But they all tended to be outside, a lot of them were outside of the institution. They might be things like Wikipedia or Facebook or whatever it might be. But students kind of instinctively understood that these were not part of what it classically meant to do academia, okay? One of the things that I've consistently found is that students are very, very astute at understanding what something that looks academic should look like. So I'll give you a really easy example. Let's say that you've got an essay to write, and you learn what you need to learn for the essay by reading a bunch of blogs and watching a lot of YouTube videos. Is that going to be what you put in your bibliography? Probably not, okay? What can happen is that you learn by going to blogs and YouTubes or whatever it might be, and then you go to the library catalogue to look for a whole load of books that look more legitimate, and you put them in your bibliography. You haven't read them, but you put them in there, okay? That's an extreme example, but that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. So what happens is because of the sort of messages that we give out as institutions, we've accidentally created this learning black market where the places and the practices that the students go to and use to do their learning, where the learning takes place, they won't tell you about, or they feel that they can't tell you about because it's not authentic. Right? I'm painting quite an extreme picture, but it's definitely something that exists. So my point is, coming out of this visitor and residence research, is that as institutions, we have to have that discussion with our students. We have to be explicit about how people go about learning and say, hey, you know, don't worry, this is not a judgmental scenario. Just tell us what you do. And then when the students and staff are discussing their practices, their real practices, you can say, okay, that's all right. That's pretty good. You know, that might not be the only thing that you want to do. That might have to be part of a larger picture. But actually, that practice is really, really useful and good for these reasons. Now, that would get rid of a whole load of paranoia, in my opinion, from the students, because they'd suddenly realize that they didn't necessarily have to hide those practices or be worried that they weren't authentic. So I think that's a really simple and useful thing that we can do with the students. So what we realized was that context was very, very important to how people engaged online. And one of the most important contexts was the difference between personal and institutional. So whether you were doing something in a personal context or whether you were doing something in an institutional context. So we added this vertical axis. And what I wanted an activity that we could do to make visible these practices in a way that wasn't just interviewing people and then trying to extract all of the goodness out of that in a standard sort of way. So we created this grid that people could map against, and that's what we're going to do now. just for sort of a few minutes, okay? So if you have got, but you can do it on screen, you can just do it in your mind. If you've got bits of paper to scroll on, then do. This is an example of my map, just so that you can see the kind of thing. So I'll go through this very, very quickly. So the place that you'd find me online, if you wanted to find me, is Twitter, okay? That's where I reside online. So I mapped that there. And for me, Twitter used to be a really personal thing, and then it gradually got more and more professional as more people followed me, and then as people who funded me followed me, and then as people I managed followed me, and then my mum followed me. So that was, so now I have to be really careful what I tweet. So that gradually came down to being in a more professional or institutional context. I blog, not very often, but I do blog, and that's always about work. So that's very much in the institutional resident. Things like Google Docs are in the middle. That's just a complete mess. There's bits of personal stuff in there, bits of professional stuff that's kind of converged. I'm not organized enough to have 2 different logins to Google, so everything's converged in the middle. And then at the more visitor end, email work. I do what I need to do in email, but I'm not particularly chatty or social or present, personally in email at work. Personal email, which is just administrative. And then what you'll notice for me, Facebook, which is pretty much gone for me now, but I used to use that just as like a really rubbish address book. I never actually said anything. It was just a way of keeping track of how many kids my friends had had. So basically, and Google searching there. So that's my map. That's how I go about doing it. And I think is everybody kind of got the hang of how that might work for themselves? Yeah? So what I wanted to do was I just wanted to take just a few minutes. Normally we do this as part of a longer workshop, but I thought that we've got a bit of time and it would be useful for you guys to have a go. The main thing is, if you've got a bit of paper and you can actually do the mapping, then do. But the main thing is to chat about your map and where your stuff is on this grid with the person who's next to you or the people who are around you. Okay, that's a really important part of the process. So I'm just going to give you 5 minutes to have a little discussion with the people around you about the kind of what your map looks like and why it looks like that. Is that okay? Yeah? It's such a beautiful room acoustically that nobody dares speak first, but you'll just all have to start mumbling. And do ask me, if you've got any questions about that, then do ask me. We've run that in people run this in various guises all over the place. And then in about 5 minutes, I'll show you some maps that have come out of different sessions. But I'm not going to show you now because you just copy them. I mean, the most significant thing in my map is that I'm not personally resident. I don't talk about my personal life online much at all. Whereas my colleague, Donna Lanclough, talks about everything all the time. And we had an interesting discussion as to why that is, okay? Now, what I've found is that no matter what shape people's maps are and where they've mapped things, they can always explain why something is where it is. They can say, I put Twitter here because I use it like this and because I'm uncomfortable about that, but I like this about it, or I put Facebook there, or I put email here. Even though it's quite difficult for us to picture the whole of our digital practice, which is why this is useful, everybody makes very, very explicit choices. We're actually all very artful about the way that we've chosen to engage. Like I've got my work email on my phone, but it's not on the home screen because I don't want to keep seeing that number going up so that I can choose when I look at it rather than the technology kind of forcing me to choose. Little things like that, hundreds of little decisions like that. You never say to somebody, I've never had a situation where I've said, well, why have you put that there? And they've gone, I don't know, it's just there. Okay, and it's the same for students and for staff. In actual fact, that's quite an important point. Is what I find is when it comes to this sort of digital engagement, an awful lot of the themes and issues are exactly the same for students and for staff. Okay, here's a map. This is one of my all-time favorite maps. This is the most extremely empty map I've ever got, okay, from a PhD student. And it's just, I've got university email, and I've got my personal email, done, okay? But this came with a really interesting note that said, I think that social media is run by a bunch of multinational evil people. I don't want anything to do with it for that reason, and this works for me. So there you go. And, just to be very clear, this could be a really good, this person could be a very successful student, all right? So we don't know. It's actually quite, from a research point of view, that's quite a difficult thing to get hold of. Do you know what I mean? You can cross-check your research against results, but how good they are at learning and all of that is quite difficult. So if you ask me the question, what does the map of a successful student look like? I'll say, I don't know. It could look various ways. Now, what I would say is that in terms of, if you've got a very traditional pedagogy, visitor mode works quite well. Because what happens is we do all these, nice sort of group and collaborative and communal pedagogies, and then at the end, everybody sits at a little desk and does an exam on their own, okay? So ultimately, all of our education tends to end up in extreme visitor mode, which is the exam, if you like. But you get other maps like this, which is more populated. And I think what's interesting here is when you look at the types of technology that have been mapped into the institutional resident quadrant, then there's a mix of kind of institutional technology, stuff that's been provided by the institution like Moodle, but then you've got other things like Skype and Twitter that are kind of encroaching, and Google, okay? And that's not unusual. So that's a good example of the sort of edges of the institution blurring, because you sit somebody in front of a computer, they can do anything that they like and they can develop their own practices. And then you get things like this, which are just super visual and creative. That's just because this person, this is how they chose to kind of express what they did. And this is one of the things that I think is really, both really nice about the maps, but also quite challenging about the maps in terms of research data, is that the maps themselves actually express the character of the individual in terms of the way that they've chosen to do it. So you can look at that map and you will make certain assumptions about what that person is like. And you can look at that map and you can make similar assumptions. I don't know whether we're right, but certainly it seems to come across, okay? So, and I like it when, you've got sad faces and smiley faces and things like that, and arrows, it's more embellished. So it's a very rich source of data, even if it's difficult to interpret. So this brings me on to one of my other principles that I wanted to talk about. And I call this Coalescent Spaces. So I don't know how that translates, but to coalesce means to flow together. It's like if you imagine two raindrops forming one big raindrop. That's what we mean by coalescent. And I think that what happens, I'm going to start with a face-to-face example and then move to pure digital, if you like. But with face-to-face teaching and learning, we tend to think of, well, we're doing this face-to-face, like we're doing now, and then we're going to go and do something that's digital, and then we're going to do something that's face-to-face, and then we're going to do something that's digital. And the way that we design our pedagogy perhaps doesn't connect those things together as well as it could do. Now, in the digital, if you think about all of the spaces and places, so as soon as we start thinking about the digital as being a set of spaces as well as a set of tools, this starts to make sense. In the digital, we can think about all of those informal spaces that students and staff are in, Facebook, Twitter, Skype, all of those kind of places, all of those Google apps. And then we can think about the spaces that we provide more formally as an institution, things like Moodle. And we know that how people go about doing their course of study involves operating in both types of space. And again, sometimes we think, well, we're going to do this in Moodle, and then you're going to go away and do that over there, and then we're going to come back and we're going to do this in Moodle, and then you're going to go. So again, pedagogically, they can feel quite distinct. What I think we can do is to start making the pedagogy flow between those two spaces, okay? So rather than sort of saying, well, we're the institution, so this is the bit of technology that we own, so this is where we do our stuff, and then you do something over there occasionally, we actually say, well, we need to design pedagogy that encompasses all of it and create a kind of, if you like, a kind of learning design sort of overlap so that these things coalesce. If I used a face-to-face example, right now, a lot of you have got screens in front of you, and I just checked Twitter, and there's a lot of things that have been tagged with me. So obviously, a lot of you are tweeting, okay? And so, I could be here and thinking, actually, it's my job to try and get your attention away from the screens, okay? And that's what can happen with technology when people bring it into spaces, is that we think that there's this attention fight. Are they looking at me or are they looking at screen? I'm not interested in that. What I'm interested in is not attention, but presence. Where are you present right now? Some of you will be more present online than you are in this room. Some of you are more present in this room than you are online, okay? Which is fine. I don't feel like it's my job to kind of fight you for attention. But in terms of designing pedagogy, let's imagine that we think about the two spaces, the physical and the digital, actually existing concurrently. Okay? So whenever you're in a digital space, you're also in a physical space, clearly, because you're a person, right? Right? And that's a very powerful idea, but sometimes we forget that. So I'm interested in pedagogy whereby the digital spaces that the students want to go into when they're sat in front of me are part of my learning design. Do you see what I mean? So I might say, let's have a discussion on a hashtag. So yesterday, I was chairing that panel, and people were tweeting on the Imagine UOC hashtag, right? And then later, somebody made that into a really lovely Storify. Now, you could imagine a scenario whereby what happens is that they make that Storify before the end of the session, we bring that up on screen, and then we have a discussion about that Storify. Do you see what I mean? So the two spaces are kind of flowing into each other. Or we have a scenario where, we've got the Twitter back channel, and every so often I look at it and I actually engage with that. So rather than having this attention fight, we just get used to this idea that it is possible for people to be present in multiple places. We're really good at it, and use that in our design. And I've got other examples of what you can do pedagogically there. I think it's the same when you're purely digital as well, between informal and formal spaces. Okay, that's quite a tough thing I find that harder to explain than it should be, but I think it makes sense. But just to take a break, okay, somebody said that memes, everybody know what a meme is? Yeah, memes are the logical completion of the postmodern, right? Now, I said that. I don't know what it means. It sounded really cool, okay? But I tweeted it, so it's been published, so it must be true. So brilliant. So what we're going to do now is just to kind of freshen our minds up a bit. I've got a kind of name that meme competition, all right? Because clearly, if you're all digital native, let's say you're all digital natives, right? I'm just being ridiculous now. Then you must know everything about everything to do with the digital, including knowing all of the memes, all right? These are classic memes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a picture of a meme up that hasn't got any text on it, and you have to tell me. You can just shout out. You have to tell me what the name of that meme is, okay? I can feel some anticipation here, okay? This is good, all right? So I think I've got 4 of these, all right? So this one, you can't do a talk about the internet without having a cat picture. What's your classic? Come on. What's your classic cat meme? Somebody. The main cat, you're all too grown up and sensible, aren't you? That's what it is. Anybody? No? It's got an acronym in it that people used to think was lots of love. Do you remember that back in the day where people would send you LOL and you'd be like, I don't know if they're in love with me or if they're laughing at me. But now it just means laugh out loud. Nobody knows this one. I'm quite surprised. No? What? Okay, this one's lolcats. So sorry. What? I love that one. Okay. So you must know, does nobody know lolcats, really? Wow! Okay, we're having a cultural moment. That's amazing. That's fantastic. So we'll see how we do with the other ones, because my assumption was that these were kind of global, but that's really interesting. Okay, well, we'll see how we go. I might win this quiz at this rate. Okay, that's a tough one. Does anybody know what that is? Yeah, oh, go on. Nyan cat, there you go. Can you tell me what Nyan cat is? No, I'll explain it. It's a cat made out of a Pop-Tart floating through the sky, and he just floats through the sky on a repeating animation for about 10 hours with really annoying music. And really, the idea is that you just have to watch it for as long as you can before you throw your laptop out of the window, because it's that annoying, okay? I don't even know why this is a thing, but it's a thing, all right? That's the beauty of memes. Okay, anybody know this one? This one's actually a little bit more difficult. This one came and went, but it was one of my favorites. Anybody see that one? You guys probably aren't digital natives yet. What? It is Keanu Reeves. Do you know what the name of the meme was? This one was called Sad Keanu, and I thought it was really, because, he's just having his lunch, like anybody else. He looks a bit sad. Somebody took a photo, and then all of this stuff came out. So you ended up with things like this, which I think is like a really, really brilliant creative thing to do. Okay, so that one came and went. This is the web. Do you know what I mean? This is part of what the web is. And I like it because it's kind of imaginative and creative. It's also quite often really offensive, so I've had to choose particular ones. Okay, and the last one. Did this travel here? This was huge. Yeah? What would you call that? Can you remember what that was called? No? Okay. So that we called Win Kid or Success Kid. Like, come on. Now, so this probably won't translate. I don't know. Okay, that does translate. That's the only one I could find that wasn't offensive. Apparently, he'd just eaten a mouthful of sand, which gives you a whole new image, version of that. Okay, so that's part of what the web is. It is these things. There are, I don't know, the estimation for the amount of cat pictures online is huge. But I think, although this is a bit ridiculous, it does demonstrate that the web is very much about people. I mean, this is definitely the version of the web that is just the collections of smiley faces, if you remember that map. This is not a server farm, okay? This is the other end of that spectrum. Okay, a horrifically complex diagram. I'm going to go through this quickly. What I wanted to do was quickly show you some of the ways that the visitor and residence mapping and work has kind of developed. So my philosophy has always been to just put everything I do out openly online and invite people to use it and modify it and do what they want with it. There's a couple of reasons for that. One, I hate the idea of doing some work and nobody seeing it. Do you know what I mean? If I put that work in, I want people to see it, right? Which is one of the reasons why I do more stuff openly online than I do write journal papers. I actually had a book proposal accepted by a publisher and then pulled out at the last minute because I realized it was a way of guaranteeing that less people would read my stuff. Okay, so I thought I'd just write about this and put it online. The other reason is because I'm a bit vain, so that's why I put things openly online. So I'm not going to go through this map in detail. This is Laurie Phipps from JISC who developed the mapping process because one of the limitations of it was that it works very well individual by individual, but how do you map a group or an organization? So one way of looking at it is what's the digital identity of your university? It's a difficult question to answer. And the way that he's done it is to split it into open content, stuff that you can only get to if you've got an institutional login, and open engagement. And in his version as well, he's changed it from visitor and resident to broadcast and engage. So that works quite well. So that's his map. Here's another map. So people have run this as a workshop, and it's not a particularly clear image, but I think what's really interesting about this one is you can see that the main way that this institution is engaging with people online is via individuals, Twitter and blogs and things like that. So they've got the kind of corporate website down here, but that's broadcast. That's not a two-way street. There's no discourse around that. But in terms of the way that the institution appears online in that more resonant fashion, it's all through individuals' accounts. There's no kind of official corporate account. And when I've coming here, it's quite interesting because you've got UOC has got quite a few official Twitter accounts, but also there are individual academics and people that are also tweeting, and that's all woven together, which I think is really, really healthy. So you'd be all over this side. I think one of the things that interests me is something like videos. Quite often, certainly at my previous institution, what would happen is they'd make a video of an academic talking about something and post it online and say, we've now done public engagement. Is it public engagement? It's not necessarily engaging, is it? Okay. Well, I think it can be engaging, but it's not engagement because there's not that two-way street of discourse. I think it's a good thing to do. So what can happen with an institution is that their presence online can be bigger via individuals than it is via the sort of official channels. That can happen. So engagement, not broadcast, I think is something that we really, really need to be thinking about. People want to connect with other people. It's expensive and it's difficult to do. But I think the days are over where you just sort of post up a load of stuff saying we're brilliant and here's why we're brilliant and here are all the ways that you can engage, that you can pay us money to do things. It has to be more than that. It has to have more of a sort of human side to it. This is another one. I'll go through this quickly. I don't know these people. I've never met them. They just picked up the idea, and apparently they got an award-winning paper at a conference through it. What they've done is they've changed the vertical axis to map how staff members appropriate bits of official technology to their own end, okay? So at the bottom there is people using what's been provided for them by the institution in the way that they're supposed to. And then you've got people who are configuring it differently, configuring it even more differently, customizing it, supplementing it, and then just replacing it. So I think this was around submission or assessment, where the institution said, here's how you deal with assessment. It's this thing in Moodle, do it that way. And a lot of people did that. But a lot of academics said, I don't want to do it that way. I'm going to bring in this module to Moodle, or I think one of them actually hacked Moodle to make it work the way that they wanted. So I think that's a really interesting way of finding the actual practice rather than what the institution thinks people are doing, if you like. This is work that Lynn, who I know is working with a couple of you guys now, has been doing as well. So she was co-PI with me on the original study. She's carried on talking, getting interviews and using the visitor and residence idea to help frame that. So what they tend to do is they'll do the mapping. Remember when I said when we started the mapping, the conversations around the maps are as important as the maps. They're kind of almost more important than the maps themselves. That's my personal view. And what happens is the maps become a kind of frame. If you go into a room and you say, let's talk about your digital practices. It's too huge, it's too complex, nobody knows where to start. But if you ask people to do the mapping, and then you take those maps away and you think about them and you look for themes, and then you go back to that group and you say, we think this is going on, let's have a chat about it. You get really, really rich stuff back. So that's what Lynn's been doing. But they've also been doing something that I think works really well, where they take a single thing like Amazon and they just plot where that's appeared across, I don't know how many maps this was, maybe 60 or 70 maps. So you can see Amazon, as you'd expect, is in the visitor personal. But let's imagine you wrote reviews or put stars on things. You'd end up coming across more to the resident, okay? I don't know what's happening in the visitor institutional. Perhaps that's people buying things directly for their study. That's Twitter. And I think that this makes a really important point, which is that the technology doesn't mandate the mode of use. So you'd imagine with Twitter that the only way you could use it was to be really resident with it. But actually, lots of staff and students, and perhaps some of you, use it, they just follow people and they don't say anything. And that's really, really effective. I call that elegant lurking. I think we've got this problem with the word lurking, just hanging around and not talking. But if you're in a lecture situation, then lots of people are in that mode, and that's fine. I think you have the same thing online. So you see, you get this spread of practice. So even though you might think that if somebody said, I've got a Twitter profile, that would mean that they had a particular way of engaging. In actual fact, there's all these different practices. And then this one that comes out of that study, which is really fascinating, which is email. And what they've done is they've split it because they were talking to librarians and students. And what you can see is that librarians were using email in a whole load of different ways, including being really quite resident and present. So if you said, how do I find you online? They'd say, well, I'm in email a lot and I'm quite happy to chat in email and all the rest of it. But the students use it in a much, much more limited way. So some of them use it in just a little bit of everything, and some of them use it in a very, very kind of, non-present way. And certainly that comes out time and time again, that students tend to see, you could argue that this was younger students. I wouldn't want to make a generational point, but that's probably the case. They see email as a very formal communication mechanism. It's like a letter, and if they want to be present as a person somewhere online, they're not going to do it via email. But you can see the difference in those shapes tells you a lot about some choices you might want to make in terms of how you engage your students if you're a librarian. And then lastly on this, could you start the video? This is Laurie again, who decided to make a Lego VNR map And I don't actually know exactly what's going on here. I'm just using it as an example of how people have been very creative with their use of it. I suspect, I haven't had a chance to talk to him, I suspect the height of the blocks is how much he cares about those places and how intensely he uses them, okay? So, there are lots of different ways it's been appropriated. So from a research point of view, I find that very pleasing. Let's see how we're doing for time. Okay, I'm going to go super fast now because I don't want to finish too much after time. This is a project, this is the sort of last project I want to talk about, so we're kind of making our way to the end here, that I did with the Higher Education Academy, and we got 18 institutions from across the UK to all do the mapping process with their students, and I got back like 300 and something odd maps, okay? So then the question is, what can you do with almost 400 maps? Because you can flick through them and go, well, that's an interesting one, or that's an interesting one, that's an interesting one. Is there a way of bringing that together that makes sense? So you can see Lynn has been doing that by going sort of technology by technology. I split it, arts and humanities, health and social science, and science, technology, engineering, and maths, because that's the way the Higher Education Academy has that very high-level split. And you've got mainly students and a few tutors that mapped. So I thought, I could layer, I took all the maps from one cohort of students and layered them all on top of each other, because I thought, I could make like a heat map. And that sort of worked. So this is a collection of business students that just happened to do the mapping. I think they all had biros or something. So all of their maps had a similar sort of aesthetic character. So you can sort of get a picture of where they're most active as a group, which is fine. But then I did the arts and humanities. It's just everywhere, because some people had used like crayon or thick marker pens, and some people had used tiny little thin. So maybe there's a trend there. When they scanned them in, there was a big fold on the paper, which you can see there as well. So it gets very messy very quickly. So maybe that works, maybe it doesn't work. What I've chosen to do more recently was it became clear that the maps do come in certain shapes, okay? This is definitely the case. So I asked Charlotte, who I work with, to go through all of those maps and just tag them with the general shape that they were. And I gave them names. The names aren't very meaningful, they just help split them up. So if you've mapped broadly across the whole of the map, social engaged, if you've got that L-shaped, social, if it's just mainly visitor, instrumental, and so on, okay? And we ended up with 208 social engaged, 64 social with nothing in institutional, and so on, all right? And what happened was, this was an interesting moment for me, is that I looked at the data of the people who'd done social engagement maps, and it was mainly 18 to 25-year-olds. And I thought, oh no, the digital native thing has come back to haunt me. But obviously, it was a convenient sample, and the vast majority of people that were mapping were between 18 and 25, okay? So I took a breath, and I analyzed the data on a ratio basis. So what proportion of what proportion of the whole group of 18 to 25-year-olds had that map? What proportion of sort of 25 to 35-year-olds had a map of that shape? And then I plotted all that, and you end up with all these lovely bright-colored circles, which is a bit too much to take in. So just quickly, I'm going to zoom into this bit here. So this is age and study level of people who have, broadly speaking, kind of mapped something in every quadrant. So they're quite engaged in various different ways. And what you can see is when you do it proportionally, actually, it does skew slightly younger, but there's a pretty even spread. So what does that tell me? Well, it tells me in a normal university, most people are between 18 to 25 in the university, and less people are older. So that means that the majority of people in terms of numbers will probably have this kind of map. But proportionally speaking, there'll be no more percentage of students with this map than there will staff. So I think that's quite significant. And you can see you get the same thing with study level, okay? Which tells me it isn't about age, it isn't about technical skill, it is about motivation to engage. And we can't expect, it's not the case that young folk have crazy, super detailed maps. And also, and I think this is really important, it's not necessarily the case that if people have detailed maps that they know what they're doing. They just have profiles on lots of different things, okay? So what I always say is, having a lot of Facebook friends doesn't mean that you're good at higher education. That's what we have to remember. And this is where I come to that idea of the conversation about the maps, okay? Is what I like doing with people, and this is something that I want to find more ways of doing, is we ask people to do the mapping, and then we ask them to annotate them. You know, write notes on them. Tell me what you're thinking on this bit of the map. Tell me what you're doing here. And that's not unlike what Lynn's doing in terms of then having a follow-up focus group. And that's where you get the good stuff, okay? So you can sort of pull all the data together, if you remember that kind of truth or method thing that I was talking about, and you can get these big sort of overviews, which do tell you certain interesting trends you can respond to at a high level. But also, you can ask people to annotate their maps. And this one's a really interesting one. So they've written some notes, but in that pink area, that's ideal self, not real, but would like to be. So that's aspirational. So this person here wants to be a really, visible online scholar. And so they've said, I want to do some blogging and some tweeting because I want to be that kind of person. And it is about the kind of person you want to be. I go back to that ontological idea, that idea of belonging and becoming. And this one, not so easy to read, but again, they've just put little comments all over it. And then you really find out what people are up to. This is at the end, this is at the truth end of truth and method. All of those circles are at the method end. And we've done this at University of Arts as well, where we got people to map and then interviewed them. And then we actually extracted quotes out of the interview and attached it to the map and put it online so you could roll over a bit of the map and then see what somebody'd said about that particular thing. So very, very rich, very, very specific to an individual. Okay, this is where I want to finish up, okay? And this is genuinely, this is how I feel about things, okay? So all of the rest of that was research and academic and quite formal in some ways. Does anybody know where this comes from? It's a tough question. It's from a novel. No, it's a really amazing novel that I can recommend. It's from 1953. It is one of the most incredible bits of science fiction I've ever read. This is from Fahrenheit 451. Don't know if you've heard of that, Ray Bradbury. And it is an amazing you're reading it and thinking, how could this guy have written this in 1953? And they have these rooms that are just full of screens that people go into, and they just consume and consume information and entertainment. So they've got a room in their house, and every wall's a screen. And this is what I don't want higher education to be. And one of the things that worries me is that you remember when I said, incoming students, they like that idea, just give me the tools and give me the resources, just give me the content, and I will just get on with it, okay? And then they get a bit miserable and a bit disengaged and drop out. And they discover what they actually need is they need to connect with people, okay? And it's not just about consuming information. My genuine worry is that what's happened with the digital is that it's become a way of perpetuating the kind of service model or that kind of process model, or at least that's where the focus has gone. And that we've got very, very good at providing content, but we still struggle to figure out ways of providing moments of contact. Now, you could argue, as the institution, that that's not entirely our responsibility. Just like in the UK, the institution doesn't necessarily own the pub that all the students go to afterwards and have a good chat. You don't own Facebook. It still exists. The students might go there and have a chat, and so maybe some of that goes on there. But I think that certainly in the UK, because of certain things that are happening politically and all the rest of it, there's always the danger that we're actually using the digital just to cram people full of more information. But I'd argue that also because of the digital, we absolutely can't do that, because our students understand that they can get hold of information without coming to the university. There's a whole load of stuff that's available openly online. So the university has to provide something else. It has to provide something more. Okay? So I'm not saying we shouldn't provide resources and information and all the rest of it. I'm saying we just need to do more than that, especially with the digital. And that's where the visitor and residence comes back in again. Because if you only think of the digital as a set of tools, you tend to end up here. But if you think about it as a set of spaces as well, then things start to work much better. So I just want to finish up on this idea of the idea of transformational education, not just transactional education. And the opportunity for us to actually, I think it was Victor that said yesterday, and I'm not sure if I've interpreted this correctly, but he said in South America there's the idea of the self-made man, okay? And that really struck me, because people go to university quite often because they want to make more of themselves. Do you know what I mean? They want to make something of themselves. And I really like that idea, because again, it's that idea of becoming. So I'm really pro, you've got to get the transactional stuff right. I understand that. It's expensive and it's difficult. We couldn't be having this conversation, the students couldn't be engaging with us if the Wi-Fi didn't work, if the Moodle wasn't good, if the resources weren't in place, okay? But more than that, we need to be finding ways of engaging our students on that engagement basis. So remember, I was talking about engagement, not broadcast. And we need to be thinking of, this is one of the reasons that I concentrate on the resident end of the continuum, not because it's better, but because it's the area we need to get better at. And you can talk about the concept of contact and what that means in the digital when you're learning, and how you go about doing that, and how you become more present. So, the way that I interpret what's happened, the implications of the web, is that the web has done a massive job for us, okay? Anything that's to do with just getting content into people, just knowledge transfer from that point of view, that's been covered, that's been done, because you can go out to the web and you can find that stuff for yourself. And rather than see that as a threat or a problem to our business model, I think it gives us an opportunity to shift back to what, for me, higher education is all about, which is helping students learn how to think, helping them to learn how to engage with each other, helping them to learn how to critically evaluate, helping them to learn to become more than they were when they arrived. So, in essence, I think the fact that the web provides all of this information and all of these opportunities, we should not see that as a threat. We should see it as an opportunity to go back to that really, really sort of liberating idea of what higher education should be and can be, which is about helping people to become more, not just filling them with more information. Thank you.